Last night we were asked about the Chinese calendar and about Sanskrit. Are they contradictions to... I'm going to ask questions. Are they contradictions? Are they contradictions to the notion that we don't have any clear history prior to the Mabul and certainly prior to Brias HaOlam? And it would seem that neither of these questions are valid questions, because the Chinese language started basically 500 years before the Common Era. There's some antecedents of the language, earlier forms, which might go back a few hundred years before that, but nothing consequential. And Sanskrit also goes back to the 2nd century before the 3rd century, before the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, which means the year, actually
they go 1600 BC.
600, so the second, the end towards the beginning of the 2nd millennium, and that is also well after the time of the Mabul. I'm not taking sides in the question of whether the Mabul was local or global. As I mentioned last night, I don't think we have to take definitive sides in that, but I don't believe there are any questions which would necessarily be a question on the Mabul taking place throughout the area which is known to be civilized land at the time. Now, when I wrote this to this guy with whom I was corresponding last night about how the Sargon is not a question, so he wrote me back, yes, but we have documented pharaohs going back to before the flood. So I see I can't win. So I didn't bother looking at the pharaohs for today to see how that works or doesn't work. But I think that I've assumed that also the pharaohs it's all based on a reconstruction of history, which is not necessarily how history actually took place. And generally speaking, there was a fellow who was a very well-known and famous mad scientist, Emmanuel Velikovsky. Velikovsky wrote a whole bunch of books which were regarded to be very wacky and strange, and eventually mainstream science accepted most of them as being actually legitimate. I'm sorry?
Do you recommend people to read the books?
Well, they're full of apicursus. If you're not bothered by apicursus, then you're okay. Like, for example, he has one of the books in which he explains how, I think it's called Worlds in Collision, where all the makos and all the things which happened in time of Yetzias Mitzrayim were all as a result of a comet having hit the earth. And he explains how the comet eating the earth would have caused all these 10 plagues to occur, including the mon coming down as the form of particles from this comet, and so on and so forth. So, if you're not bothered by that kind of stuff, so they are interesting books to read. But what's interesting is he says that all Egyptologists messed up Egyptian history because they basically repeated the series of pharaohs twice, because they were a certain document which, without getting into the complexity, a certain document which they placed too early, and therefore had a whole bunch of, I forget if it's too early or too late actually. Anyway, there was a certain document which he holds they misdated it by like 1,000 years, and therefore what happened was they repeated history. 1,000 years of Egyptian history basically are duplicated. Now, there's a book called The Sea Peoples. I haven't looked at it in many years, but that actually is one of the books they use in reconciling the scholars use in reconciling the Jewish system of chronology with the non-Jewish system of chronology, is this assumption that history was doubled. I think what it was is that
Egyptian history was doubled.
Egyptian, yeah. In other words, yeah.
Is that where all other history is basically being...
All other history, most history comes from Herodotus, the Greek historian, and then but he only goes back, like to 700, 800 before the Common Era, I forget what, and after that, and then people add on to that from what they find. But Herodotus is the basic skeleton. Okay.
How reliable is he when he writes a lot of the myths and he writes them?
He's reliable to say that he heard it from other people. He's not reliable to say it actually happened.
I heard that his methodology for writing stuff down was, hey, this sounds cool.
Right. He went around collecting stories. That's what he did. He went around collecting stories.
We trust that fact?
We don't. but most people who ask questions on the Torah from history are assuming that Herodotus was more reliable.
He was also an anti-Semite, right?
No, I don't think he mentions the Jews at all, if I recall correctly. They don't figure it in his work. But the aside is like this. There's so many textbooks and so many articles and so many things in the popular press which say that the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash took place in 586 BCE, right? And that the secular historians are right and that the Jewish historians are wrong, that everybody gets poisoned by this and begins to believe that they actually have more validity than we do. They surely have better sources than we do, right? So that's not true. It's a bunch of baloney. They don't have better sources than we do. They have, in fact, not as good sources as we do.
Nobody writes a history book saying, well, we're stipulating that this happened and saying, well, in 1475 BCE, this pharaoh reigned, and that's what happened.
That's exactly what they write.
So, what do you expect from a child?
What?
So...
No, it's a tragedy. I'm not blaming the Tinoko Shanishbu, the poor people who were brought up on those history books. They're tragically misguided. They're not going to burn in hell for that. It's okay. It's too bad that there are Orthodox Jews who fall for it as well. Yeah.
Which pharaoh was the pharaoh that was the last one that said the Jews?
You think we know?
I think you know.
There's a fellow. I should really show this film once. The Exodus Decoded.
Oh, that's pretty good.
You saw it?
Yeah.
So he's some cool guy from Toronto. I think he's from Jew. Some called Yakubovich. So he has a whole theory that the last paro was the paro named Achmose. There is such a paro, and that he was called What?
No, he was the first monarch.
I don't remember, but he was also according to Yakubovich, he was called Achmose because he was the brother of Moshe Rabbeinu. Achmose, right? Because they're both brought up in the same household. So it's cute. It's cute. I know it's true. It's cute.
We're gonna name this pharaoh.
Yeah. So, but we don't know. For all we know, Achmose in Egyptian means strong and mighty. I don't know, but it's a cute coincidence, which he puts it about a little bit later than it's put in the standard chronologies. Any other questions on this topic?
Why do most people say it's Ramses II?
Because they placed the Exodus earlier.
Okay, but according to where we
It says, it said they built Pithom and Ramses. So some indication, if they built the city called Ramses, that there was a surrounding time of Ramses. I mean, you wouldn't name a city now Lincoln just because Abraham Lincoln was president for 150 years ago, would you? I'm just kidding. Of course you might. Yes, you're looking far too serious.
Oh. The implications of what you said.
Didn't they just name that rename Robert Kennedy or something, that new highway or something?
I was being facetious.
Right, yes, I'm saying like that, yeah.
Yes. It's entirely possible that a city might be called Lincoln today. But that's how they associate with Ramses.
So according to our timeline, who would it be according to whatever timeline the Egyptians might have been mistaken on?
We're closer to Achmoshe, but it's not precise according to either one. If you take the secular chronology as being true, that's the whole point. Who knows the secular chronology is true? But if you think it's true, so we're closer to Achmoshe, but not precise.
Okay, but I mean, assuming, even with ours being continuous and theirs not, there's going to be a certain amount of gap, either one way or another. So.
See, the problem is that history is usually written about kings.
Right.
So therefore, we don't have. There's very little written about, especially when the kings are defeated. They try to avoid writing about that. So it's very hard to match up historical records of the country which won with the country which lost.
Right.
So in this case, I don't know. It's hard to come by Egyptian precise records of when the Jews left Egypt.
Do we have any records of like Amalek? Do we know anything about what happened?
There's some people identify them with the Hyksos. I know some people identify the Hyksos being the Jews. Yeah.
Who is Hyksos?
Hyksos were people lived in that area in the south of Israel. But Amalekites,
Are they the same as Hittites?
no.
And they say they're assume they were Jews, no?
What?
A lot of people assume they were Jews.
A lot of people say the Hyksos were the Jews, yeah. Right. In the Exodus decoded, boy, I'm so tired tonight. Forgive me. I don't know. Also became exhausted. But the Exodus decoded. So there he calls he says that this is one of the weaker points in the film, is that some deciphered hieroglyphics talk about a nation called the Amo going down to Egypt, and he wants to say Amo means Amo Yisrael, like the nation of Israel. Yeah, it's not, it says Amo, not Am, and I don't think they were called Am Yisrael yet at that time. They were called Ivrim, but okay, but.
But he had those hieroglyphics with those payas.
Yeah.
I didn't know if he had payas in that.
That's very cool that they had hieroglyphics with beards, especially with the beards. This thing that he found hieroglyphics. They say that there's no Egyptian archaeological evidence that the Jews were ever in Egypt. It's not true. There are a lot of archaeological evidence if you interpret it about being the Jews. So like in certain Pharaoh's pyramid. So they have wall paintings of people coming down to Egypt with beards and payas and looking like Chassidim, only they were bare-chested. So but the idea obviously would be that this could well be referring to the Bnei Yisrael. Okay.
Stop here?
Yeah, I think so.